Welcome back, everyone. We are going to continue to read The Man in the Black Suit. Let me try and lift this up a little bit. Alright. I understand your grief, little fisher boy, but that particular argument just doesn't hold water, I'm afraid. He spoke in a tone of bogus comfort that was horrible, maddening, without remorse or pity. A man can go his whole life without seeing a mockingbird, you know? But does that mean mockingbirds don't exist? Your mother... The fish jumped below us. The man in the black suit frowned, then pointed a finger at it. The trout convulsed in the air, its body bending so strenuously that for a split second it appeared to be snapping at its own tail. And when it fell back into Castle Stream, it was floating lifelessly, dead. It struck the big gray rock where the waters divided, spun around twice in the whirlpool eddy that formed there, and then floated off in the direction of Castle Rock. Meanwhile, the terrible stranger turned his burning eyes on me again, his thin lips pulled back from tiny rows of sharp teeth in a cannibal smile. Your mother simply went through her entire life without being stung by a bee, he said, but then, less than an hour ago. Actually, one flew in through the kitchen window while she was taking the bread out of the oven and putting it on the counter to cool. No, I won't hear this. I won't hear this. I won't. I raised my hands and clapped them over my ears. He pursed his lips as if to whistle and blew at me gently. It was only a little breath, but the stench was foul beyond belief. Clogged sewers, outhouses that have never known a single sprinkle of lime, dead chickens after a flood. My hands fell away from the sides of my face. Good, he said. You need to hear this, Gary. You need to hear this, my little fisher boy. It was your mother who passed that fatal weakness on to your brother Dan. You got some of it, but you also got a protection from your father that poor Dan somehow missed. He pursed his lips again, only this time he made a cruelly comic little tisk-tisk sound instead of blowing his nasty breath at me. So, although I don't like to speak ill of the dead, it's almost a case of poetic justice, isn't it? After all, she killed your brother Dan as surely as if she had put a gun to his head and pulled the trigger. No, I whispered. No, it isn't true. I assure you it is, he said. The bee flew in the window and lit on her neck. She slapped at it before she even knew what she was doing. You were wiser than that, weren't you, Gary? And the bee stung her. She felt her throat start to close up at once. That's what happens, you know, to people who are allergic to bee venom. Their throats close and they drown in the open air. That's why Dan's face was so swollen and purple. That's why your father covered it with his shirt. I stared at him, now incapable of speech. Tears streamed down my cheeks. I didn't want to believe him, and knew from my church schooling that the devil is the father of lies. But I did believe him, just the same. I believed he had been standing there in our dooryard, looking in the kitchen window as my mother fell to her knees, clutching at her swollen throat while Candy Bill danced around her, barking shrilly. She made the most wonderful, awful noises, the man in the black suit said reflectively, and she scratched her face quite badly, I'm afraid. Her eyes bulged out like a frog's eyes. She wept. He paused, then added, She wept as she died. Isn't that sweet? And here's the most beautiful thing of all. After she was dead, after she had been lying on the floor for 15 minutes or so with no sound but the stove ticking and with that little stick of a bee stinger still poking out of the side of her neck, so small, so small. Do you know what Candy Bill did? That little rascal licked away at her tears, first on one side and then on the other. He looked out at the stream for a moment, his face sad and thoughtful. Then he turned back to me, and his expression of bereavement disappeared like a dream. His face was as slack and avid as the face of a corpse that had died hungry. His eyes blazed. I could see his sharp little teeth between his pale lips. "I'm starving," he said abruptly. "I'm going to kill you and tear you open and eat your guts, little fisher boy. What do you think about that?" "No," I tried to say. "Please, no." But no sound came out. He meant to do it, I saw. He really meant to do it. "I'm just so hungry," he said, both petulant and teasing. "And you won't want to live without your precious mommy anyhow. Take my word for it, because your father's the sort of man who'll have to have some warm hole to stick it in, believe me. And if you're the only one available, you're the one who'll have to serve. I'll save you all that discomfort and unpleasantness. Also, you'll go to heaven. Think of that. Murdered souls always go to heaven. So we'll both be serving God this afternoon, Gary. Isn't that nice?" He reached for me again with his long, pale hands, and without thinking what I was doing, I flipped open the top of my creel, pawed all the way down to the bottom, and brought out the monster brookie I'd caught earlier, the one I should have been satisfied with. I held it out to him blindly, my fingers in the red slit of its belly from which I had removed its insides as the man in the black suit had threatened to remove mine. The fish's glazed eye stared dreamily at me, the gold ring around the black center reminding me of my mother's wedding ring, and in that moment I saw her lying in her coffin with the sun shining off the wedding band and knew it was true. She had been stung by a bee. She had drowned in the warm, bread-smelling kitchen air, and Candy Bill had licked her dying tears from her swollen cheeks. "Big fish," the man in the black suit cried in a guttural, greedy voice. "Oh, big fish." He snatched it away from me and crammed it into a mouth that opened wider than any human mouth ever could. Many years later, when I was 65, I know it was 65 because that was the summer I retired from teaching, I went to the New England Aquarium and finally saw a shark. The mouth of the man in the black suit was like that shark's mouth when it opened, only his gullet was blazing red, the same color as his awful eyes, and I felt heat bake out of it and into my face, the way you feel a sudden wave of heat come pushing out of a fireplace when a dry piece of wood catches alight. And I didn't imagine that heat either. I know I didn't, because just before he slid the head of my 19-inch brook trout between his gaping jaws, I saw the scales along the sides of the fish rise up and begin to curl like bits of paper, floating over an open incinerator. He slid the fish in like a man in a traveling show swallowing a sword. He didn't chew, and his blazing eyes bulged out, as if in effort. The fish went in and went in. His throat bulged as it slid down his gullet, and now he began to cry tears of his own, except his tears were blood, scarlet, and thick. I think it was the sight of those bloody tears that gave me my body back. I don't know why that should have been, but I think it was. I bolted to my feet like a jack released from its box, turned with my bamboo pole still in one hand and fled up the bank, bending over and tearing tough branches of weeds out with my free hand in an effort to keep up the slope more quickly. He made a strangled, furious noise, the sound of any man with his mouth too full, and I looked back just as I got to the top. He was coming after me, the back of his suit coat flapping and his thin gold watch chain flashing and winking in the sun. The tail of the fish was still protruding from his mouth, and I could smell the rest of it, roasting in the oven of his throat. He reached for me, groped with his talons, and I fled along the top of the bank. After 100 yards or so, I found my voice and went to screaming. Screaming in fear, of course, but also screaming in grief for my beautiful dead mother. He was coming along after me. I could hear snapping branches and whipping bushes, but I didn't look back again. I lowered my head, slitted my eyes against the bushes and low-hanging branches along the stream's bank, and ran as fast as I could. And at every step I expected to feel his hands descending on my shoulders, pulling me back into a final hot hug. That didn't happen. Some unknown length of time later, it couldn't have been longer than 5 or 10 minutes, I suppose, but it seemed like forever. I saw the bridge through layerings of leaves and furs, still screaming, but breathlessly now, sounding like a tea kettle, which was almost boiled dry. I reached this second, steeper bank, and charged up to it. Halfway to the top, I slipped to my knees, looked over my shoulder, and saw the man in the black suit almost at my heels, his white face pulled into a convulsion of fury and greed. His cheeks were splattered with his bloody tears, and his shark's mouth hung open like a hinge. "Fisher boy!" he snarled, and started up the bank after me. Grasping at my foot with one long hand, I tore free, turned, and threw my fishing pole at him. He batted it down easily, but it tangled his feet up somehow, and he went to his knees. I didn't wait to see any more. I turned and bolted to the top of the slope. I almost slipped at the very top, but managed to grab on one of the support struts running between the bridge and save myself. "You can't get away, Fisher boy," he cried from behind me. He sounded furious, but he also sounded if he were laughing. "It takes more than a mouthful of trout to fill me up." "Leave me alone," I screamed back at him. I grabbed the bridge's railing and threw myself over it in a clumsy somersault, filling my hands with splinters and bumping my head so hard on the boards when I came down that I saw stars. I rolled over onto my belly and began crawling. I lurched to my feet just before I got to the end of the bridge, stumbled once, found my rhythm, and then began to run. I ran as only 9-year-old boys can run, which is like the wind. It felt as if my feet only touched the ground with every third or fourth stride, and for all I know, that may be true. I ran straight up the right-hand wheel rut in the road, ran until my temples pounded and my eyes pulsed in their sockets, ran until I had a hot stitch in my left side from the bottom of my ribs to my armpit, ran until I could taste blood and something like metal shavings in the back of my throat. When I couldn't run anymore, I stumbled to a stop and looked back over my shoulder, puffing and blowing like a wind-broke horse. I was convinced I would see him standing right there behind me in his natty black suit, the watch chain a glittering loop across his vest and not a hair out of place, but he was gone. The road stretching back toward Castle Stream between the darkly massed pines and spruces was empty, and yet I sensed him somewhere near in those woods, watching me with his grass-fire eyes, smelling of burnt matches and roasted fish. I turned and began walking as fast as I could, limping a little. I'd pulled muscles in both legs, and when I got out of bed the next morning, I was so sore I could barely walk. I didn't notice those things then, though. I just kept looking over my shoulder, needing again and again to verify that the road behind me was still empty. It was, each time I looked, but those backward glances seemed to increase my fear rather than lessening it. The firs looked darker, massier, and I kept imagining what lay behind the trees which marched behind the road, long, tangled corridors of forest, leg-breaking deadfalls, ravines where anything might live. Until that Saturday in 1914, I had thought that bears were the worst thing the forest could hold. Now I know better. A mile or so further up the road, just beyond the place where it came out of the woods and joined the Geegum Flat Road, I saw my father walking toward me and whistling the old oaken bucket. He was carrying his own rod, the one with the fancy spinning reel from Monkey Ward. In his other hand he had his creel, the one with the ribbon my mother had woven through the handle back when Dan was still alive. Dedicated to Jesus, that ribbon said. I had been walking, but when I saw him, I started to run again, screaming, "Dad! Dad! Dad!" at the top of my lungs and staggering from side to side on my tired, sprung legs like a drunken sailor. The expression of surprise on his face when he recognized me might have been comical under other circumstances, but not under these. He dropped his rod and creel into the road without so much of a downward glance at them and ran to me. It was the fastest I ever saw my dad run in his life. When we came together, it was a wonder the impact didn't knock us both senseless. Then I struck my face on his belt buckle hard enough to start a little nosebleed. I didn't notice that until later, though. Right then, I only reached out my arms and clutched him as hard as I could. I held on and rubbed my hot face back and forth against his belly, covering his old blue work shirt with blood and tears and snot. "Gary, what is it? What happened? Are you all right?" "Ma's dead," I sobbed. "I met a man in the woods and he told me, Ma's dead. She got stung by a bee and it swelled her up just like what happened to Dan. And she's dead. She's on the kitchen floor and Candy Bill licked the tears off her face," was the last word I had to say, but by then my chest was hitching so bad I couldn't get it out. My tears were flowing again, and my dad's startled, frightened face had blurred into 3 overlapping images. I began to howl, not like a little kid who skunned his knee, but like a dog that's seen something bad by moonlight. And my father pressed my head against his hard, flat stomach again. I slipped out from under his hand, though, and looked back over my shoulder. I wanted to make sure the man in the black suit wasn't coming. There was no sign of him. The road winding back into the woods was completely empty. I promised myself I would never go back down that road again, not ever, no matter what. And I suppose now God's greatest blessing to his creatures below is that they can't see the future. It might have broken my mind if I had known I would be going back down that road, and not 2 hours later. For that moment, though, I was only relieved to see we were still alone. Then I thought of my mother, my beautiful dead mother, and laid my face back against my father's stomach and bawled some more. "Gary, listen to me," he said a moment or two later. I went on bawling. He gave me a little longer to do that, then reached down and lifted my chin so he could look into my face and I could look into his. "Your mom's fine," he said. I could only look at him with tears streaming down my cheeks. I didn't believe him. I don't know who told you different, or what kind of dirty dog would want to put a scare like that into a little boy, but I swear to God your mother's fine. But he said, I don't care what he said. I got back from Eversham's earlier than I expected. He doesn't want to sell any cows. It's all just talk, and decided I had time to catch up with you. I got my pole and my creel, and your mother made us a couple of jelly foldovers. Her new bread, still warm. So she was fine half an hour ago, Gary. And there's nobody knows any different that's come from this direction, I guarantee you. Not in just half an hour's time. He looked over my shoulder. Who was this man? And where was he? I'm going to find him and thrash him within an inch of his life. I thought 1,000 things in just 2 seconds. That's what it seemed like anyway. But the last thing I thought was the most powerful. If my dad met up with the man in the black suit, I didn't think my dad would be the one to do the thrashing or the walking away. I kept remembering those long white fingers and the talons at the ends of them. Gary? I don't know that I remember, I said. Were you where the stream splits, the big rock? I could never lie to my father when he asked a direct question, not to save his life or mine. Yes, but don't go down there. I seized his arm with both hands and tugged it hard. Please don't. He was a scary man. inspiration struck like an illuminating lightning bolt. I think he had a gun. He looked at me thoughtfully. Maybe there wasn't a man, he said, lifting his voice a little on the last word and turning it into something that was almost but not quite a question. Maybe you fell asleep while you were fishing, son, and had a bad dream, like the ones you had about Danny last winter. I had a lot of bad dreams about Dan last winter. Dreams where I would open the door to our closet or to the dark, fruity interior of the cider shed and see him standing there and looking at me out of his purple, strangulated face. From many of these dreams I had awakened screaming and awakened my parents as well. I had fallen asleep on the bank of the stream for a little while, too, dozed off, anyway. But I hadn't dreamed, and I was sure I had awakened just before the man in the black suit clapped the bee dead, sending it tumbling off my nose and into my lap. I hadn't dreamed him the way I had dreamed Dan. I was quite sure of that, although my meeting with him had already attained a dreamlike quality in my mind, as I suppose supernatural occurrences always must. But if my dad thought that the man had only existed in my own head, that might be better. Better for him. It might have been, I guess, I said. Well, we ought to go back and find your rod and your creel. He actually started in that direction, and I had to tug frantically at his arm to stop him again and turn him back toward me. Later, I said. Please, Dad? I want to see Mother. I've got to see her with my own eyes. He thought that over, then nodded. Yes, I suppose you do. We'll go home first and get your rod and creel later. So we walked back to the farm together, my father with his fish pole propped on his shoulder just like one of my friends, me carrying his creel, both of us eating folded over slices of my mother's bread smeared with black currant jam. Did you catch anything? He asked as we came in sight of the barn. Yes, sir, I said. A rainbow. Pretty good sized. And a brookie that was a lot bigger, I thought, but didn't say. Biggest one I ever saw, to tell the truth, but I don't have that one to show you, Dad. I gave that one to the man in the black suit, so he wouldn't eat me, and it worked, but just barely. That's all? Nothing else? After I caught it, I fell asleep. This was not really an answer, but not really a lie either. Lucky you didn't lose your pole. You didn't, did you, Gary? No, sir, I said, very reluctantly. Lying about that would do no good, even if I'd been able to think up a whopper. Not if he was set on going back to get my creel anyway, and I could see by his face that he was. Up ahead, Candy Bill came racing out of the back door, barking his shrill bark and wagging his whole rear end back and forth the way Scotties do when they're excited. I couldn't wait any longer. Hope and anxiety bubbled up in my throat like foam. I broke away from my father and ran to the house, still lugging his creel and still convinced in my heart of hearts that I was going to find my mother dead on the kitchen floor with her face swelled and purple like Dan's had been when my father carried him in from the west field, crying and calling the name of Jesus. But she was standing at the counter, just as well and fine as when I had left her, humming a song as she shelled peas into a bowl. She looked around me, first in surprise and then in fright as she took in my wide eyes and pale cheeks. Gary, what is it? What's the matter? I didn't answer, only ran to her and covered her with kisses. At some point my father came in and said, Don't worry, Lo, he's all right. He just had one of his bad dreams down there by the brook. Pray God it's the last of them, she said, and hugged me tighter while Candy Bill danced around our feet, barking his shrill bark. You don't have to come with me if you don't want to, Gary, my father said, although he had already made it clear that he thought I should go back, that I should face my fear, as I suppose folks would say nowadays. That's very well for fearful things that are make-believe, but 2 hours hadn't done much to change my conviction that the man in the black suit had been real. I wouldn't be able to convince my father of that, though. I don't think there was a 9-year-old that ever lived who would have been able to convince his father he'd seen the devil come walking out of the woods in a black suit. "I'll come," I said. I had walked out of the house to join him before he left, mustering all of my courage in order to get my feet moving, and now we were standing by the chopping block in the side yard, not far from the woodpile. "What you got behind your back?" he asked. I brought it out slowly. I would go with him, and I would hope the man in the black suit with the arrow straight part down the left side of his head was gone. But if he wasn't, I wanted to be prepared as I could be anyway. I had the family Bible in the hand I had brought out from behind my back. I'd set out just to bring my New Testament, which I had won for memorizing the most Psalms in the Thursday night youth fellowship competition. I managed 8, although most of them except the 23rd had floated out of my mind in a week's time. But the little red testament didn't seem like enough when you were maybe going to face the devil himself, not even when the words of Jesus were marked out in red ink. My father looked at the old Bible, swelled with family documents and pictures, and I thought he'd tell me to put it back, but he didn't. A look of mixed grief and sympathy crossed his face, and he nodded. "All right," he said. "Does your mother know you took that?" "No, sir." He nodded again. "Then we'll hope she doesn't spot it gone before we get back. Come on, and don't drop it." Half an hour or so later, the two of us stood on the bank looking down at the place where Castle Stream forked, and at the flat place where I'd had my encounter with the man with the red-orange eyes. I had my bamboo rod in my hand. I'd picked it up below the bridge, and my creel laid down below on the flat place. Its wicker top was flipped back. We stood looking down, my father and I, for a long time, and neither of us said anything. Opal, diamond, sapphire, jade. I smell Gary's lemonade. That had been his unpleasant little poem, and once he had recited it, he had thrown himself on his back, laughing like a child who was just discovered he has enough courage to say bathroom words like shit or piss. The flat place down there was as green and lush as any place in Maine that the sun can get to in early July, except where the stranger had lain. There the grass was dead and yellow in the shape of a man. I looked down and saw I was holding our lumpy old family Bible straight out in front of me with both thumbs pressing so hard on the cover that they were white. It was the way Mama Sweet's husband, Norville, held a willow fork when he was trying to douse somebody a well. "Stay here," my father said at last, and skidded sideways down the bank, digging his shoes into the rich, soft soil and holding his arms out for balance. I stood where I was, holding the Bible stiffly out at the ends of my arms like a willow fork, my heart thumping wildly. I don't know if I had a sense of being watched that time or not. I was too scared to have a sense of anything, except for a sense of wanting to be far away from the place of those woods. My dad bent down, sniffed at where the grass was dead, and grimaced. I knew what he was smelling, something like burnt matches. Then he grabbed my creel and came back up the bank, hurrying. He snagged one fast look over his shoulder to make sure nothing was coming along behind. Nothing was. When he handed me the creel, the lid was still hanging back on its cunning little leather hinges. I looked inside and saw nothing but 2 handfuls of grass. "Thought you said you caught a rainbow," my father said. "But maybe you dreamed that too." Something in his voice stung me. "No, sir," I said. "I caught one." Well, it sure as hell didn't flop out. Not if it was gutted and cleaned. And you wouldn't put a catch into your fisher box without doing that, would you, Gary? I taught you better than that. Yes, sir, you did, but... So if you didn't dream catching it, and if it was dead in the box, something must have come along and eaten it, my father said. And then he grabbed another quick glance over his shoulder, eyes wide, as if he had heard something move in the woods. I wasn't exactly surprised to see drops of sweat standing out on his forehead like big, clear jewels. Come on, he said. Let's get the hell out of here. I was for that, and we went back along the bank to the bridge, walking quick without speaking. When we got there, my dad dropped to one knee and examined the place where we'd found my rod. There was another patch of dead grass there, and the lady's slipper was all brown and curled in on itself, as if a blast of heat had charred it. While my father did this, I looked in my empty creel. He must have gone back and eaten my other fish, too, I said. My father looked up at me. Other fish? Yes, sir. I didn't tell you, but I caught a brookie, too. A big one. He was awfully hungry, that fella. I wanted to say more, and the words trembled just behind my lips, but in the end, I didn't. We climbed up to the bridge and helped one another over the railing. My father took my creel, looked into it, then went to the railing and threw it over. I came up beside him in time to see it splash down and float away like a boat, riding lower and lower in the stream as the water poured in between the wicker weavings. It smelled bad, my father said, but he didn't look at me when he said it, and his voice sounded oddly defensive. It was the only time I ever heard him speak just that way. Yes, sir. We'll tell your mother we couldn't find it, if she asks. If she doesn't ask, we won't tell her anything. No, sir, we won't. And she didn't, and we didn't, and that's the way it was. That day in the woods is 81 years gone, and for many of the years in between I have never even thought of it, not awake at least. Like any other man or woman who ever lived, I can't say about my dreams, not for sure, but now I'm old, and I dream awake, it seems. My infirmities have crept up like waves which will soon take a child's abandoned sandcastle, and my memories have also crept up, making me think of some old rhyme that went, in part, just leave them alone and they'll come home, wagging their tails behind them. I remember meals I ate, games I played, girls I kissed in the school cloakroom when we played post office, boys I chummed with, the first drink I ever took, the first cigarette I ever smoked, corn shuck behind Dickie Hammer's pig shed, and I threw up. Yet of all the memories, the one of the man in the black suit is the strongest, and glows with its own spectral haunted light. He was real. He was the devil, and that day I was either his errand or his luck. I feel more and more strongly that escaping him was my luck, just luck, and not the intercession of the God I have worshipped and sung hymns to all my life. As I lay here in my nursing home room, and in that ruined sandcastle that is my body, I tell myself that I need not fear the devil, that I have lived a good, kindly life, and I need not fear the devil. Sometimes I remind myself that it was I, not my father, who finally coaxed my mother back to church later on that summer. In the dark, however, these thoughts have no power to ease or comfort. In the dark comes a voice which whispers that the 9-year-old boy I was had done nothing for which he might legitimately fear the devil either. And yet the devil came, and in the dark I sometimes hear that voice drop even lower into ranges which are inhuman. Big fish. It whispers in tones of hushed greed, and all the truths of the moral world fall to ruin before its hunger. Big fish. The devil came to me once long ago. Suppose he were to come again now. I am too old to run now. I can't even I can't even get to the bathroom and back without my walker. I have no fine large brook trout with which to propitiate him either, even for a moment or two. I am old and my creel is empty. Suppose he were to come back and find me so, and suppose he is still hungry. And that's the end of the story, but now we've got the afterword. It's a small little bit. So from Stephen King's perspective, my favorite Nathaniel Hawthorne story is Young Goodman Brown. I think it's one of the 10 best stories ever written by an American. The Man in the Black Suit is my homage to it. As for the particulars, I was talking with a friend of mine one day, and he happened to mention that his grandpa truly believed, that he had seen the devil in the woods, back around the turn of the 20th century. Grandpa said the devil came walking out of the woods and started talking to him just like a natural man. While Grandpa was chinning with him, he realized that the man from the woods had burning red eyes and smelled like sulfur. My friend's grandpa became convinced that the devil would kill him if he realized Grandpa had caught on, so he did his best to make normal conversation until he could eventually get away. My story grew from my friend's story. Writing it was no fun, but I went on with it anyway. Sometimes stories cry out to be told in such loud voices that you write them just to shut them up. I thought the finished product a rather humdrum folktale told in pedestrian language, certainly miles from the Hawthorne story I liked so much. When the New Yorker asked to publish it, I was shocked. When it won first prize in the O. Henry Best Short Story competition for 1996, I was convinced someone had made a mistake. That did not keep me from accepting the award, however. Reader response was generally positive, too. This story is proof that writers are often the worst judges of what they have written. So that's the end for today. Next week we will do part 1 of In the Death Room. Let's see. This is page 131. There we go. So next week we will do part 1 of In the Death Room, and we will close out October with part 2 of In the Death Room. So we will see you guys next week, and hope you are enjoying the series.